Something went quiet in me the moment I saw my daughter-in-law's car parked in my driveway at 7 in the morning. Not the kind of quiet that comes with peace. The other kind. My name is Agnes Whitfield. I am 63 years old, a retired school librarian, a grandmother of 3, and until that Tuesday in October, I believed the worst thing a family could do to you was forget your birthday. I had no idea people who sat at my table and ate my food could plan something so cold and so careful that it would take months before I understood all of it. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it began, not where I first felt something was wrong, that came later, but where the plan first showed itself to me on a Tuesday morning when I opened my front door still in my robe and found my daughter-in-law, Heather, standing on the porch with a smile that arrived half a second too late. My son Kevin had married Heather 11 years ago. She was pretty in a careful way, the kind of woman who matched her earrings to her sweater and laughed at exactly the right moments. I had tried to love her the way a mother tries to love the person her child chooses. Some days it worked. Some days it felt like reaching for a handshake and getting only fingertips. That morning she said she was in the neighborhood. She said she missed me. She said she missed me. She said Kevin had been working too hard and she just needed some coffee and company. I poured the coffee. I sat across from her. I listened. She talked about the grandchildren, about my granddaughter Maisie's school play coming up, about how my grandson Cooper had finally learned to ride his bike without the training wheels. Then, so smoothly it almost disappeared inside the other conversation, she said, "Agnes, I don't suppose you still have that original stock certificate your father left you?" Kevin was just wondering if we should update the family records. I said I wasn't sure where it was. She smiled. "Of course," she said. "No rush." After she left, I stood at the kitchen sink and looked at the yard for a long time. The leaves were turning. The dog was asleep on the back step. Everything looked exactly the same as it always did, but something in me had shifted. I did not say anything to my husband Frank that morning. Frank was 67, recently retired from the electric company, and the most even-tempered man I had ever known. He believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. He believed in not borrowing trouble. He would have told me Heather was just being Heather, and maybe he would have been right. So I said nothing. And that silence was the first mistake I made. 3 weeks later, Kevin called and invited us to Thanksgiving at their house. This was not unusual. We had gone to Kevin and Heather's house for Thanksgiving before. They had a nice dining room and Heather made a decent pie. But this year, Kevin mentioned twice that we should bring the lockbox, the blue metal one from the closet. He said Heather wanted to show the kids some old family photos she thought might be in there for a history project. I told him I wasn't sure what was in it anymore. He laughed and said, "Just bring it anyway, Mum." I hung up and sat down at the kitchen table and thought about Heather's visit 3 weeks before. 2 separate questions about the same box of family records, from 2 people who lived together and could have simply asked once. I did not sleep well that night. I want to tell you something about intuition, because a lot of people, kind people, reasonable people, will tell you that a feeling is just a feeling, that you need evidence, that you should not assume the worst of your own family. I had believed that my whole life. I had raised my children to believe it too, and it had served me well in most places. But there is a different kind of knowing. Not panic, not paranoia. Just a quiet certainty that settles in your body like cold water. That is what I felt driving to Heather and Kevin's house on Thanksgiving morning, with Frank beside me humming to the radio and the blue lockbox sitting in the back seat. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself to be grateful and enjoy the holiday. I told myself I was a 63-year-old woman being ridiculous. We got off the highway and turned onto the long road that leads to their subdivision, and that is when I saw the other car. It was a silver sedan I did not recognize, parked on the grass at the far edge of their driveway behind the azalea bushes where the neighbor's fence begins, not in front of the house. Not in the driveway where guests park, back into the side, the way someone parks when they do not want to be easily seen from the road. 2 people were sitting inside. Neither of them got out when we pulled up. Frank noticed me staring. "Agnes?" I looked at the house. Kevin had come out the front door and was walking down the porch steps toward us. He was smiling, but he looked at that silver car before he looked at us. Just for a second. But I saw it. "Frank," I said quietly, "don't take the lockbox inside." He looked at me. "Just leave it in the car," I said. "Lock the car and leave it." He did not ask me why. We have been married for 41 years and he has learned to read the difference between worry and warning. We went inside. The house smelled like turkey and something sweet. Maisie ran at me from the hallway and wrapped her arms around my waist. Cooper was on the floor with a puzzle. Everything looked exactly like Thanksgiving was supposed to look. But I kept thinking about that silver car. About a half hour in, while Frank was in the living room with Kevin watching the game, Heather came into the kitchen where I was helping set out the side dishes and said, very gently, "Did you bring the lockbox, Agnes?" I looked at her. I forgot it. Her expression changed. Not much, just around the eyes. "Oh," she said. "That's okay." And she went back to the stove. 2 minutes later, I heard her voice from the hallway, low and quick. She was on the phone. I caught 3 words before she moved farther away. She said she didn't bring it. I set down the spoon I was holding and walked out of the kitchen, through the dining room, and directly to the front window. The silver car was still there, and now one of the doors was open. A man was standing outside it, looking at the house. My whole body went cold. I turned and found Frank. I did not make a scene. I did not raise my voice. I walked over to him, put my hand on his arm and said, "We need to go. Right now. Something is wrong." He looked at me once. Just once. "Get your coat," he said quietly. We said we forgot something in the car and would be right back. Kevin followed us to the door. "Mom, you just got here. I know, sweetheart." I kept my voice completely normal. "We'll be right back." He stayed on the porch watching as we walked to the car. I got in. Frank got in. He started the engine. "Don't go back," I said. He pulled out of the driveway and drove down the street without looking back. We made it 6 blocks before either of us said another word. "Tell me everything," Frank said. So I did. I told him about Heather's visit in October, about Kevin's phone call, about the silver car parked in the side yard, about the phone call I had overheard, about the man standing outside the car looking at the house. Frank gripped the steering wheel the way he grips it when he is trying very hard not to react too fast. "And you didn't say anything," he said. "Not accusing, just stating." "No," I said. He nodded slowly. "Why not?" I looked out the window. "Because I hoped I was wrong." He exhaled. "Okay." A pause. "The lockbox is in the back seat." "Yes." "So whatever they wanted, they don't have it." "Yes." He turned at the light and headed toward town instead of home. "I'm not going home until we know what this is," he said. "If Kevin sent someone to the house while we were supposed to be at Thanksgiving dinner, I don't want us there." I had not even thought of that. The house, left empty. I reached for my phone with a shaking hand and called our neighbor Deb, who has a spare key for emergencies. I told her something had come up and asked if she could sit in her driveway and keep an eye on our place for a couple of hours. She sounded surprised, but she said yes. Then Frank pulled into the parking lot of a diner off Main Street, the kind of place with red stools and coffee that tastes like it has been there since 1987, and we sat in a corner booth and I started talking. Not just about that morning, about everything. I told him about the year Kevin's business had started going sideways, the contracting company he had started with his friend Lyle, who had since quietly disappeared from the picture. The loans Kevin mentioned once and then never mentioned again, the way Heather had stopped asking us to Sunday dinner around the same time she started asking careful questions about our finances. I told Frank about the time 8 months ago when Kevin had asked how much equity we had in the house. Frank set down his coffee cup. I told him about the time Heather had asked over the phone whether Frank still used the same investment advisor or whether we had moved anything around lately. Frank was very still. I told him about finding a copy of our property tax bill on the floor of the guest room the last time they had visited. Not the current one, an old one from 4 years ago. The kind you would only be looking for if you were researching property values. Frank said, "Agnes, why didn't you tell me any of this?" And there it was. The question I'd been dreading. "Because I loved him," I said. "And I didn't want to be right." Frank looked at the table. After a moment he said, "We need to call someone." We called our daughter Isabel, who lives 40 minutes away and works in county administration and does not rattle easily. She picked up on the second ring. When I told her what had happened that morning, she was quiet for a few seconds and then she said, "Stay where you are, I'm coming." While we waited, Kevin called 3 times. Heather sent a text that said the turkey was ready and the kids were asking where we were. Frank looked at the messages and said, "Don't answer." I didn't. But then Kevin called a fourth time and something made me pick up. Maybe I still needed to hear his voice. Maybe some part of me was hoping for an explanation that would make everything ordinary again. "Mom." He sounded cheerful, almost too cheerful. "Where are you guys? Heather saved you the good chairs." "We're running an errand," I said, a small pause. "An errand on Thanksgiving? Kevin?" My voice came out steadier than I expected. "Who is in the silver car?" Silence. Not the silence of someone confused, the silence of someone recalculating. "What silver car?" he said. "The one parked behind the azaleas in your side yard." Another pause. Then his voice shifted. Not angry yet. Careful. "Those are just friends of Lyle's. They were helping set up the yard last week, and they stopped by to pick something up." "On Thanksgiving morning," I said, "parked out of sight." "Mum, you're making this into something it isn't." "Then explain it to me plainly," he exhaled. "Just come back. Bring the box. We can talk about everything over dinner. This is a family holiday." That word. Family. Used the way people use a key on a locked door. "We're not coming back," I said. The cheerful voice disappeared entirely. "Mum, you need to stop this. What did you need from the lockbox, Kevin?" "Nothing. Then, just some paperwork. To make things easier. You don't understand how much pressure we're under right now." "Tell me about the pressure." His breath came hard through the phone. "We owe money, Mum. A lot of it. The business didn't work out the way Lyle said it would. Heather's been handling it, but there are people now who aren't patient. And we just thought if we could use the land certificate as temporary collateral, just for a bridge loan, we would put it back before you ever even—" "You thought you could use my father's land certificate," I said slowly, "as collateral for a debt I didn't know about. It was only temporary, without asking me. We were going to explain everything at dinner, with two men in a car in your side yard." He didn't answer. I looked across the table at Frank, who had heard every word on speaker. His face had gone the color of old paper. "How much do you owe?" I asked. Kevin was quiet for a long moment, then enough that we needed help. "How much?" $180. "Maybe a little more with the fees." I pressed my fingers to the edge of the table and breathed in slowly. "Kevin," I said, "those men sitting in that car, did you tell them we would sign something today?" The pause told me everything before he spoke. "I told them it was very likely." I closed my eyes. "Very likely," I repeated. "Mum, they're not dangerous. They're just— You invited your parents to Thanksgiving dinner," I said, "and you parked men in your side yard in case your mother didn't cooperate." He didn't speak. "I have to go," I said. "Mum, please, if you call the police, everything falls apart. The kids, the house, all of it." I looked at Frank. His eyes were wet, which I had not seen in years. "You should have thought about the kids before you planned this," I said. And I ended the call. Isabel arrived at the diner 22 minutes later. She walked straight to our booth, looked at my face, and sat down without taking off her coat. "Tell me everything from the beginning," she said. So I told her. All of it this time. No protecting Kevin. No softening the edges. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We're calling the sheriff's non-emergency line. Not 911. Non-emergency. And we're doing it right now." Frank said, "Are you sure?" Isabel looked at him steadily. "Dad, they had men waiting in a car. We called. The deputy who came to the diner was a tall man named Grayson who smelled like coffee and listened without interrupting. He asked to see my phone. He read Heather's texts. He listened to the brief recording Frank had made on his phone when he held it up during the call with Kevin. He wrote things down in a small notebook. Then he said, 'Mom, do you know the lender is?' I said I didn't know the name. He said that the type of situation I was describing, private debt, property documents, people waiting at a location, was something their office had seen before, and that it fell into a range of activities they needed to look into more carefully. He asked if we were willing to make a formal statement. We said yes. What followed was the part of this story that doesn't move quickly. It moved the way legal things move, slowly, with a lot of paperwork and waiting and phone calls to an attorney named Charles, who had handled our wills years ago and now found himself in a very different conversation with us. But a few things happened that week that I want to tell you about. The first was the lockbox. When we got home that evening, Deb's car was in our driveway, bless her. Frank opened the blue metal box on the kitchen table. Inside were the things I expected: old insurance papers, my parents' marriage certificate, some savings bonds from the 1980s, and at the bottom, in a worn envelope, my father's original land certificate for the 14 acres in Allegheny County he had left me when he died. That piece of paper was what Kevin had needed, not a copy, the original, because without the original, the transfer of collateral would not have been legally binding in the way the lender required. I sat with it in my hands for a long time. My father had worked for 40 years at a mill to buy that land. He hunted there. He took Kevin there to fish when Kevin was small enough to need help with the worm on the hook. He left it to me because he trusted that I would take care of it. I put the certificate back in the envelope, and the next morning I drove it directly to the bank and put it in a safe deposit box. The second thing that happened was a phone call from Maisie. She was 11. She called from a number I didn't recognize, which turned out to be a neighbor's phone, and she said, "Grandma, are you okay? Daddy and Mummy are fighting and I don't know what's happening." I told her I was safe. I told her I was safe. I told her she had done exactly the right thing calling me. I told her to go to her room, lock the door, and that I would make sure someone came to check on her. I called Isabel immediately. Isabel called the county's family services line and gave them the address. 2 workers went to the house that afternoon. Maisie and Cooper and the baby were fine physically, shaken and confused, but not in any danger. Kevin was not at the house. Heather was, and she gave the workers a version of events in which everything was a misunderstanding brought on by stress and family tension. The workers were not fooled. The third thing that happened, 4 days later, was that the 2 men from the silver car were identified. One was a private debt collector working for a lender that operated out of a business address in another state. The other was a man with a prior record involving financial coercion in 2 counties. When Deputy Grayson told us that, I had to put my hand flat on the table to keep myself steady. Financial coercion. In 2 counties. These were not patient businessmen Kevin had brought to Thanksgiving. These were not Lyle's friends picking something up. These were men who made a living at frightening people into signing things. And my son had called them to his house for dinner. Kevin was brought in for questioning on a Friday. He arrived with an attorney he had apparently hired the day after Thanksgiving, which told me he had been expecting this. He gave a statement. So did Heather, separately. Their stories did not match in several places, which is the sort of thing that makes situations like this worse for everyone involved. I gave my statement the following Monday. I sat in a small room with Deputy Grayson and the attorney who represents the county's financial crimes unit, and I told them everything. The October visit. The phone call about the lockbox. The Thanksgiving invitation. The side yard. The call in which Kevin told me the men were there to ensure cooperation. That word, cooperation, landed in that room the way it had landed in my chest, like something that did not belong in a family. I did not cry during the statement. I cried afterward in the parking lot with Isabel's hand on my back until I had nothing left. Then I dried my face and went home. The weeks that followed were hard in a way I don't have clean words for. Kevin called several times from numbers I didn't recognize. Twice I answered, and twice the calls were painful in different ways. The first time he was angry. He said I destroyed the family. He said the children would grow up knowing their grandmother had put their father in this situation. I let him finish. Then I said, you put yourself in a situation the moment you decided that your parents were a resource to be managed instead of people to be honest with. He hung up. The second time he was quieter. He said he knew he had made terrible choices. He said Heather had pushed the plan further than he had wanted. He said he had been scared for 2 years and had not known how to ask for help. I believed part of that. Maybe the fear was real. Probably the fear was real. But fear does not explain hiring men. Fear does not explain 2 separate trips by 2 different people to ask about the same lockbox. Fear does not explain the forged power of attorney document that turned up later in the discovery process. A draft, still unsigned, with my name written across the bottom in handwriting that was almost mine, but not quite. When Charles showed me that document, I sat with it for a long time. My name, practiced, written over and over in the margins. Someone had sat with a pen and practiced writing my name. I do not know, to this day, whether that was Kevin or Heather. I think it was Heather. Something about the way the letters leaned told me it was Heather. But I do not know for certain, and courts do not work on what a mother thinks she knows. The children. I want to tell you about the children. Maisie came to stay with us for 3 weeks while the situation with Kevin and Heather moved through its legal process. Cooper came too. The baby, Rosie, stayed with Heather's mother, which was the right call because she was not yet 2 and babies need their routines more than anything else. Maisie was quiet at first. She helped me in the garden without being asked, which is something she had never done before. She pulled weeds without speaking and I let her be quiet because some things need to be processed in silence before they can be said out loud. On the 4th day, while we were putting away groceries, she said, "Grandma, did you know something was wrong before Thanksgiving?" I thought about lying. Children deserve protection. But Maisie was 11 and she had called me from a neighbour's phone and asked if I was safe, and that was not the action of a child who needed to be kept ignorant. I had a feeling, I said, but I didn't trust it enough at first. She put a can of soup on the shelf. I had a feeling too. I stopped moving. At the table the day before, she said, Daddy was on the phone for a long time and he kept looking at the window, and Mommy kept asking me if I thought he would really come. I looked at this child, this 11-year-old with her father's eyes and her mother's careful hands, and I felt something tear open quietly in my chest. "That wasn't your job," I said. "None of this was your job." She nodded, but I could see she was still carrying some of it. Children do that. They absorb the weather of the adults around them, and then they believe the weather is somehow their fault. I told her what I wished someone had told me at her age, that noticing something wrong does not mean you caused it, that speaking up is almost always better than staying quiet, that people who love you do not put you in situations where you have to guess what is true. She listened with that serious, steady way she has. "Okay," she said after a moment, and then she put away the rest of the soup cans. The legal process moved slowly. I will spare you most of the details because the details are dry and confusing, and honestly, I did not understand half of them myself. Charles walked us through everything with patience. Kevin was charged. Heather was charged, separately. The debt collector with the prior record was charged. The other man cooperated with the investigation and his situation was handled differently. The lender was investigated. It turned out to operate in the way that such things often do, just enough distance from anything clearly illegal to make the case complicated, but close enough that the Financial Crimes Unit took an interest. Lyle, Kevin's former business partner, was found eventually. He had his own separate problems in a different state. I will leave it at that. Frank and I changed all of our locks. We changed our passwords, our security questions, the contact information on our bank accounts. Charles helped us set up a structure for the land certificate that made it much harder for anyone to access without several layers of verification and a waiting period. That felt like closing a gate after damage had already been done. But at least the gate was closed. 6 months after Thanksgiving, Kevin wrote me a letter. He wrote it by hand, which I noticed because it meant he had sat with it. He could not have typed it and deleted it 7 times the way you can with an email. He had to mean every word enough to keep it on paper. He said he was sorry, not the desperate sorry of a man trying to stop consequences, a different kind of sorry, the kind that has had time to sit with the thing it did and understand it fully. He wrote that the worst moment of the entire ordeal, not the arrest, not the hearing, not the loss of the house, was hearing Cooper ask, the morning after Thanksgiving, why Grandma and Grandpa hadn't stayed for pie. He wrote that he had not had an answer. I sat with that letter for a long time. Then I wrote back. 1 page. I told him that sorry matters most when it changes the next choice, not the last one. I told him that trust is built in years and broken in minutes and rebuilt, if it is rebuilt in years again. I told him that I loved him in the way you love someone whose actions you cannot excuse and whose childhood you cannot forget. Both things at once. That is what it is to be a mother. I told him that when he was ready to be honest. Not about the plan was already documented, but about who he had become and how I would listen. I sealed it and mailed it and cried for 20 minutes and then made tea. Heather's situation resolved differently. She took a plea. Her attorney argued that she had been under extreme financial pressure and had followed Kevin's lead. I'm not sure how much of that was true. I'm not sure it matters to me anymore. What matters is that Rosie, when she is old enough, will know that her grandmother's door was open even when everything else was not. Maisie still calls me every Sunday. She calls from her own phone now, which she got for Christmas. She tells me about school and her friends and a girl in her class who she is not sure she likes but also kind of does. Normal things. Wonderful things. Cooper has started fishing with Frank on Saturday mornings, which was something Kevin used to do with us when he was Cooper's age. I don't know if Frank chose that on purpose or if it just happened. It doesn't matter. What matters is Cooper sitting in the boat with his grandfather at 6 in the morning talking about nothing, learning the patience that sitting quietly over water teaches a person. Last spring, on a Saturday, when the weather was exactly right, Frank and I drove out to Allegheny County. We parked on the gravel pull-off near my father's land and walked the fence line the way my father used to walk it on Sunday afternoons. The trees were coming in, the creek was running. A hawk sat on a fence post and looked at us without moving until we were 10 feet away and then lifted off like it had somewhere important to be. Frank took my hand. We stood there for a while without saying anything, which is something you can only do with someone after many years. Then he said, "Your father would be glad you kept it." I thought of the envelope, the worn paper, the signature in my father's handwriting at the bottom. He would have been glad I fought for it, I said. Frank squeezed my hand once. On the way home, I thought about that Thanksgiving morning, about the silver car behind the azaleas, about the feeling that settled in my body like cold water and that I'd spent weeks telling myself to ignore. I had almost ignored it all the way to the table. That is the part I will carry the longest. Not what Kevin did, not the forged name in the margin of a document. What I almost let happen because I did not want to be the kind of mother who suspected her child. Because I confused protecting my son with protecting the truth. These are not the same thing. I know that now in a way I cannot unknow. If you have a feeling, not panic, not paranoia, the quiet kind that lives in your body and will not leave, do not wait for a reason to trust it. The reason usually arrives too late, and if someone in your family is carrying a secret that involves your name on a document, I want you to know, finding out is not the end. The finding out is actually the beginning of the only version of things that can heal, the version made of truth. If this story stayed with you, leave a thought in the comments. I read everyone. And subscribe if you want to hear what happens next, because this family is still standing, and that is its own kind of story. I have thought a lot about what causes a person to end up in a situation like mine, not what Kevin did. That part is documented now, filed away in courthouse records I never wanted to exist. I mean the longer chain of it. The years before that Thanksgiving morning, the choices that stacked up so quietly I did not notice their weight until I was already buried under them. The honest answer is that I helped build the conditions that made what happened possible. Not deliberately, not with any bad intention. But intentions do not change outcomes. I spent years softening things for Kevin, a poor grade explained away, a borrowed sum quietly repaid on his behalf, a conflict smoothed over at dinner so the meal could finish in peace. Each one felt like love. Each one taught him, without my ever saying a word, that consequences were negotiable and that I would be there to absorb them. That is not love. I understand that now. Love that removes every sharp edge from a person's path does not prepare them for the world. It prepares them to be shocked and desperate when the world does not cooperate. And desperate people make terrible choices. Kevin made terrible choices. Could I had spent 20 years teaching him that choices had soft landings? The courage I showed on that Thanksgiving morning, trusting the cold feeling in my body, telling Frank to leave the box in the car, walking away from my own son's driveway. That was not something that came naturally to me. It came from somewhere I had been building without knowing it, from all the smaller moments I had chosen quiet over truth, and then felt the cost of it afterward. By the time I was standing in that driveway, something in me had finally had enough of its own silence. That is the thing about wisdom. It does not arrive as a gift. It accumulates from the places you got it wrong. Every time I had looked away from something uncomfortable in my family, I was paying a slow installment on what eventually happened. And every time, going forward, that I choose to speak plainly, to Maisie, when she asked me hard questions, to Kevin in that letter, to myself in the parking lot of a courthouse after giving a statement about my own child. I am spending what I earned the hard way. Maisie understood something at 11 years old that took me decades. She noticed the wrong thing and she said something. She called from a neighbour's phone and asked if I was safe. That kind of moral clarity, knowing that noticing is not enough, that noticing has to become action, is not something you are born with. It is something you practice, and the earlier you start, the less it costs you later. Frank never once said, "I told you so." In 41 years of marriage, through everything, he never used that phrase. That is its own kind of wisdom, the kind that holds a person steady instead of proving a point. What I want to leave you with is this. Every relationship in your life is either building trust or quietly spending it. You do not always see which one is happening until the account is empty. Pay attention to the small signals. Trust the quiet knowing in your body when it speaks. And when someone you love is doing something wrong, the most loving thing you can do for them, for yourself, for every child watching, is to say so clearly and hold the line. That is what I wish I had known at 40. At 50. I know it now at 63, and it cost me more than it should have. But I am still here, and so is Frank, and so is Maisie calling every Sunday, and so is Cooper in a fishing boat on Saturday mornings learning what patience looks like from a man who never stopped practicing it. That is enough. Some days it is more than enough.